Well, I've found another spring. Just taken it from the mortal remains of another shutter, and see if we can get this seated into position. Yeah, it's not keen. And I'll hook that into, well, that shutter release lever is very keen on getting away. That's a bit unusual. Normally they stay where they're put better than that. It doesn't appear to have much bounce on it. I think that spring's going to need some tension. Now let me get this spring hooked on here onto that arm. That's much better. That's working correctly. That works fine. My only concern here really is that I don't have much spring tension on that shutter release lever there, and I'm going to attempt to tighten that up slightly. I don't know if I'll be successful. Better, but it's not as strong as I'd like it to be. That feels good, but I'm not convinced that end's tucked in properly. No, it's not. Difficult getting the end of this spring position. No, that's okay. It's tucked in properly now and it has enough bounce to it. I'm fairly happy with the action here. I just feel enough bounce on that spring to make me think it'll probably work. At this stage we've got so much in the shutter, it's virtually complete. The main lever needs to go in, and of course the shutter speeds settings cam plate. So I'll just lubricate that cam plate with a bit of molybdenum paste once around the centre, because it has to turn freely on the lens tube. The lens tube is the name of this central piece here. I'll run some around the cam surfaces that the retard gear train will run on, and there's a spot that picks up the 500th of a second spring. That's under quite a bit of force. I'll get that on there. Let's look at the main lever. The main lever, again I want to wipe molybdenum paste around the centre where that runs on the lens tube, around the outside face where it contacts various bits and pieces, on the tip of the bird paw here, and on the tail of the bird paw here. That runs on that little, there's a little guide track in the shutter, and I don't want it scraping on there or being rough in any way. Now here, I want some here, some here. The lever here that operates the pallets, we just want some on there, and here is the lever on the retard gear train that has quite a bit of friction there, so we get that done. See if I can stay in camera for a change, that'd make a difference. Right, so I'll unhook this spring, we'll put the main lever in place, I've cocked that action, that just swings that lever out of the way so I can drop the spring in easier. Should drop down there, hold back that, swing back that lever, drop that down into the body, hook the main spring over the post. Now that main spring's got an extra twist in it because it was in upside down, or it was hooked on upside down. It's probably taken a bit of a set. See if I can get this spring seated on that lever. Check that everything is seated. That's not. It is. B lever seems to be floating a bit high. Alright, we'll try it and see what happens. I'll try getting this plate in place. There could be any number of faults here because this is, okay, B works. That's a flying start. That certainly wasn't going to work before. Let's try 1 second. It works. This somewhere around here would be about a tenth. Seemed a bit slow. That B lever is floating high. You can see that sitting right up there. It might need to be bent down slightly. Yeah, it definitely will be. Let's see if we can get that in a happier space. Right, I'm going to put the cover on this and see how it works. That B lever is going to cause me grief. Let's put the cover on it. I want to find out roughly what the speeds are like, that if all the speeds work, and whether they are proportionate in that when you, as you move along the scale, whether they get slower in one direction and faster in the other in the correct fashion, that nothing sticks. Given the evil things that have been done to the shutter, there's every likelihood that things aren't as they should be. Let's try this on 1 second. Certainly runs smoothly enough. On a tenth. That actually didn't sound too bad. On 25th. Okay. 50th. 100th. The 250th. And the 500th. So we've got to set that to 500 before cocking the shutter. Yeah, no, the shutter blades did open and close. It's very hard to tell that with a 500, it's so quick. Alright, well I'm going to test the shutter speeds on this and find out what they're like. Find out if they are fairly credible. With a shutter like this, the speeds are marked 1, half, 5th, 10th, 25th, 50th, 100th, 250th and the 500th. Now, when these shutters were new, all the speeds would have been pretty good. They were probably within 10% of the marked range. They only needed to be within 20% in order to be regarded as being within tolerance, but they were probably within 10% of the marked speeds, with the exception of the 2 top speeds. the 250th and the 500th. Well, the 250th, that was probably more like a 200th. The 500th was probably more like a 400th of a second. And that was when they were new. At that point they would be considered within tolerance. They were only just within tolerance, but that was as close as they were likely to get. The high speeds are the ones that you're least likely to get accurate, because they depend on a number of things. They depend on the shutter being clean and correctly lubricated and everything moving freely. They also depend on the springs. Now there are 3 springs involved when it's on the highest speed. On the 250th and below, there are 2 springs involved. You have your main spring, which drives the shutter blades, drives it open. It swings the blades open, it pushes the timer and completes that action once the timer, the retard gear train is run down. To close the blades, there is simply a small spring here. Now that doesn't change under any of the speeds. The blades are not forced closed, they close under the action of that return spring. So if that spring's tired, even if the other spring is good, you're not going to get good speeds. If both springs are tired, and there's every likelihood they will be because springs get tired, then there's no danger the shutter's going to produce an accurate speeds, particularly at the high end of the range. It's less of a problem at the low end of the range because we are introducing a resistance in order to slow the speed down to what we want. So of course we can introduce less resistance and have a faster speed to compensate for springs. But at the high speed, no, you're never likely to get the marked speed. I had a shutter like this. It was new old stock. It had never been on a camera, and there's every likelihood that it sat in the cupboard there in the uncocked condition for all that 60 odd years. But when I cleaned it and tested it, I couldn't get a 500th of a second or a 250th of a second out of it. And that was a shutter that was brand new, shiny, the springs had never been stretched. This, I need to test the speeds. Well, I shifted the retard gear train slightly at the pallet's end, and that sped that up slightly, and the speeds look pretty good. I'm quite happy with the state of those. So I need to get the outer case back on here, which means I need to connect up my flash connection. So I've straightened up this flash connection wire because it had got somewhat bent out of shape when I had to free it up from its where it was effectively glued in by the melted because the connection, the little post had been effectively melted by solvent. Now I'll just get this little plastic insulator in place. And I've got a screw there to tighten that up. Just get that in position. I typically find it easier to use a larger screwdriver to get that screw started than try and start it with a small screwdriver. Now I've got it there, I can use a small screwdriver to drive that thing home. If I cock the shutter, take the curved cocking rack here, just run some molybdenum paste down the inside edge of that and both sides so that it doesn't have any noticeable, it reduces the friction between that and the case. That should drop into a slot in the case. I can push the case on, get that all down in position. We have two screws, one that actually came with the shutter, and a replacement for the missing one that should have been here. This is our detents, the detent for the aperture settings. So if I swing the lever right across to the F2 end, I can slide that under, get that in its groove, clip the other end up into its groove, and check that the detents do in fact work. So the aperture is all set. Our shutter is ready to have the lenses put back in it and put back on the camera. But of course I haven't cleaned them yet. Well, I started on the rear lens, I didn't do anything to the front lens. So I've got to start cleaning this, or at least deciding what I'm doing with it. It looks pretty dirty to me. Well, here's the front component. I'm just going to clean the front surface first. There's a lot of rubbish on there, so as you can see by that, so you need to clean it once or twice to remove all pieces of grit or dust or anything off there. Remove all the loose stuff. I mean, traditional advice is to use a camel's hair brush or some such to clean any loose dust off the surface, but a lot of times the dust is not loose. It's quite sticky. It's stuck on there. So a wet swab is often better to get loose, supposedly loose stuff off. Stuff that you do not want to be grinding into the glass. So now I've cleaned that front surface, and I can tell by reflected window light here how clean I've got that. The front surface looks pretty good. The rear surface looks very dirty, so I'm going to clean that. It feels dirty. When you apply a cotton bud with solvent, with glass cleaner on there, it will feel less than smooth. It might feel sticky if there's some contaminant on there. And that's how this felt. Now I can turn this over and look from the front, because it's easier to judge a heavily concave surface when you're looking at it from the other side. And I'm looking with the window light, looking to see what I've got there. Yeah, it's a bit dirty looking. I don't know where all that dirt is. Some of it may be on the rear surface of the front element, or the front surface of the cemented pair at the back. I'm going to unscrew this whole assembly. There's two tiny screws here which lock this. I'll back those right up. Try not to unscrew them completely, because if you drop them you'll lose them and then you won't like the result. And this rear piece comes off, that unscrews. So here we have our rear group. That's two pieces of glass cemented together. So we've only got two surfaces we can clean there. So I'll clean both of those surfaces and have a look. It's not uncommon on a Retina IIa camera for the internal surface here to be hazy. The haze is often uncleanable. It's a deterioration of the glass. No amount of cleaning is going to get rid of it. there are no magic solvents that will remove that haze. That haze is a permanent feature, it's deterioration of the glass itself. It must have been something specific to the optical glass used for those lenses. It's not a common feature with earlier xenons, and it's not a common feature with later xenons. Nor is it a common feature with the Xenar lenses of the same vintage as these xenons. So it was something to do with the specific glass used, and it's just deteriorated over time. Well, that's pretty good. I can see a bit of marking around the edge here somewhere, but the glass itself, yeah, well, you can see filth coming off there, so there's a bit of filth around the back of this. I'll see if I can clean around there. But the glass itself seems pretty good. It's about the only thing on this camera that has been good. Let me clean that internal surface again. And hold it up to the window light. Judge what I've got. That looks good. I'm pleased with that. And the front piece of glass here, well, the front surface cleaned up quite well. I'm looking at the rear surface of this. Sometimes you get haze on there. To tell the truth, that looks pretty good. I'm just going to stand that on something so I can clean it easily and then put this back together. Well, here I've just got that sitting on a rubber friction tool, and I'll just clean this internal surface. As I said, this one looked pretty good, so making sure I leave no smears on this. That looks okay. And now I can get its mate back over it. Check that I haven't got any dust inclusions in there. Haven't left any smears in there that I should have seen the back of. That looks quite good, and I can screw that lens case back together. That should just be finger tight. Do it up as tight as you can with your fingers. That's plenty. You do not need to use a spanner or anything else on it. And I'm pretty happy with the state of that lens. That's a very good example. Now, some of the blackening around the edge there is, I'm just looking to see how, no, it looks pretty good. That's okay. If there was a serious loss there, I'd replace that. I'm going to have to do something with the rear group, but not this one. So we have our trim ring that goes in there. And I'll just blow this out to make sure there's no dust in here. Blow the lens. Put our front group in position. Screw that down tight. Again, that's only finger tight, you don't need any more than that. Oh, I can see a mark on a shutter blade there. Let's see if we can see the back of that before we close this up. No, that's a permanent feature now. That's a scratch or some small defect in the shutter blade. You always get a magnified view when you're looking through the lens, so it makes it any minor cosmetic mark more obvious, but no, that'll be fine. So the rear group. Well, the rear group, the problem with this was that it had lost its paint from around the edge and was very, very dirty. I'm going to have to give this a thorough cleaning, both front and rear surfaces, to judge whether this is constructed in much the same way as that front group. And I need to decide whether I'm going to have to split it up, remove this piece of glass here, or not. So I'll clean this surface. This is the rearmost surface, the one facing the film. Now there's certainly a mark on there. I think it was a little bit greasy. I think it's got a few smear marks because it was a little bit greasy. Let me try cleaning it again. There's certainly nothing serious wrong with that surface. The coating all looks good. Let me look at that again. And I can see that innermost surface looking through, and that's pretty good too. There's just a small smear there somewhere. I'll clean that again. But generally it looks good. It's a very good example of a xenon lens from a Retina IIa camera, because so many of them are poor examples. That looks good. So that leaves me my final problem with this lens was the lack of the black paint around the edge. I've got a black paint marker. I'm going to try using that. Let's see if this will do the job for me. That appears to go very well. Oh yeah, I'm happy with that. First time I've used one of those paint markers, paint pens, and it is a very good result. Right, let's put that in place. It screws into the back nice and neatly now, unlike when it came out, because of course it had been stuck in there with the paint that had been washed down by the solvent that had been flushed in there. Okay, that lens is ready to put back on the camera body. Okay, let's get this in place. You've got to get this cocking action timed correctly. That was not, so I'll just move this as far forward as I can and move the curved rack one notch forward. Should be about there, and see if it'll cock. No, not quite. Let's do it again. No. Okay, shutter winds and fires there. Now the proof is when you turn this to a 500th of a second and try the same. If it cocks and fires on a 500th, you've got it right. It does. That's good. I can put the... Oh, I haven't got my shim on here. Let's go back. Get this shim in position, otherwise nothing will be correctly focused. Let's try again. Alright, let's move that forward one notch. Again. Oh, the shutter release on the shutter pops out of the arm. That appears to be good. Put the retaining ring in the back. And there we have it, that's all good. So, I need to do a bit more final work on this camera, just to tidy up its appearance. As you can see, there's a few chips and scratches on that leather where it's lost colour. It's generally in pretty good state. But what I'll do with that is I will use a black marker pen to darken all those spots, and then I'll polish that with a black wax polish. And that'll look good. And that makes a good working camera out of this, and it certainly wasn't very promising to start with. I'm happy with the state of this now. I think it's ready to go back to its owner. So it's a neat and tidy Retina IIa camera, complete and working, which is not what you could say about it when it came in. But interestingly, the owner had told me that this camera was in good cosmetic condition but hadn't worked for a while. Now that casts some light on the problems that we've all faced in the past buying cameras on eBay. If the owner, with no reason to lie to me, told me that the camera was in good cosmetic condition and simply hadn't worked in a while, it seems to me that he was completely unaware that somebody'd been in here and done such a butcherous job on it, removing pieces, leaving pieces out, bending pieces out of shape, and generally making it into something that it wasn't previously. Now, if the owner was capable of making that mistake, it seems extremely likely that any random person who's picked up a camera at a garage sale somewhere or a yard sale and then put it onto eBay and describes it as being in good condition or working, they're not necessarily a fraudster. They're just ignorant. They just do not know what's happened. And I think that probably explains a lot of the rubbish cameras that we've bought in the past on eBay. Not that the seller was a crook, but just that he didn't know what he was handling. He didn't know what was on the inside. He could only judge from the outside with his own imperfect knowledge. And so there you go, an interesting one. But this camera can go back to its owner. The list of parts. Now what went into this? Well, if we start at the top, with our film advance lever here, well obviously it needed a piece of leather because that piece was missing. The end of film catch inside the lever, that was missing. Getting down further into this mechanism, what did we have there? Oh, well, the frame counter spring was broken. Okay. If we delve deeper into the camera body, we got to the rangefinder, that was simply in pieces. There wasn't a particular problem there. The shutter release. Let's look at the shutter release. The shutter release was missing the collar underneath the shutter release shaft that limits the travel. It was missing the return spring. It was missing the spacer that should have sat on the shaft of the shutter release mechanism. What else with the body? Oh, at the base here, the surround here for the tripod socket. One screw was obviously missing. Well, as it turns out, the other screw was sheared off as well, and this was just glued into place on the leather. So the two screws were gone there, and that needed to be sorted out. And of course, then we get to the serious problem with this camera, which was the shutter. And in the shutter, well, there was a lot of pieces needed replaced there. I was able to straighten up a good number of those parts that I really thought I was going to have to scrap. But I was able to straighten them up, so I had to replace all the flash contact stuff. The fixed flash contact had to be replaced because it had been melted by solvent. Someone had flood cleaned it. Various springs and bits and pieces in the shutter, of course, were gone. The B lever was gone, so there was no B speed previously. And yeah, somebody generally made an incredible mess of that. I'm just about to take my hat off them that they were able to make a shutter that seemed to work out of what they'd left behind after they'd removed all the important bits. But there you have it. Anyway, this one, a nice Retina IIa camera. Wouldn't look out of place in anyone's collection, and certainly fit for taking photos now. But oh geez, that was a real roughie when that one came in. So there you have it. Thanks for watching.